Hello model railroaders, I'm Dave. Welcome back to the layout. This will be my 100th upload onto my YouTube channel, and it is going to be a video in making this mold. It will be a long video, so I hope that you stick with it right to the end, and I'm hopeful that you'll get some information that I've been able to convey out of it on how to make a silicone mold. So stick with it, and we'll see you at the end of the video. Hello model railroaders, I'm Dave. Welcome back to the layout. Getting ready to make a mold box to pour the casting silicone to make a mold of these items that you see before you. To start with, I'm using a fairly large sheet of glass that I've had for years and years. A small mirror would suffice, or a piece of window pane. Just of course be careful of any glass edges if you're using something that's silica based. Don't cut yourself or tape the edges up. In my case, the platform is fairly large and the desk that I have it on is not level. So what I've done is I've, in 3 locations, usually the 2 ends, so that end is unshimmed, and then I have shimmed the center of the one side and the opposite corner. By doing a 3-point, you'll get it level very quickly. If you go with 4, you'll be trying to get it to level. Just don't go there. It's faster just to do a 3-point for leveling. For my walls of the mold box, I'm using some dry erase foam core board. And there's the image there. It was $4 at our Canadian at our dollar store here. Now I've made sure that there's no sticky stuff at all on the surface of the glass. I've gone over it with Windex and a paper towel after I went through with a scraper blade, a razor blade scraper, just to ensure that there's nothing on the surface that will pick up the imperfections. The smoother your surface, especially, because remember, this is going to be the bottom of your casting, the top of your casting, which is the bottom right now, when you actually do make or cast your UltraCal 30 or your plastic resin into the mold once it has been created. So having a very smooth top of the silicone where you pour whatever in and then go to flatten the base, or what will become the base of whatever you're making a cast of, it is a whole lot easier going as smooth as possible. I know this from experience. I've used the construction foam as a base before, and once you pour the resin on it, it's miserable cleaning up the castings. Trust me on this, the smoother the surface you can get, the better, which is why I'm using dry erase board, as it's got the coating on it on the cardboard, so it will release from the mold easier, and I may be able to reuse the box walls that I'll fabricate. However, that's not the main point. It's just getting a smooth mold, and I will show you a mold in another video because it's packed away at the moment, of the example of where I used the foam, and it's just, if I could remake that mold, I would, if it wouldn't cost me so much in materials and time to do it. Luckily, it's something I don't cast very often or have a need of. In making the mold, you want to orientate your items so it makes sense. I don't want a very narrow and long mold because I want to use the pressure pot to shrink any air bubbles that may be present in the casting while it is still in a liquid state. To do that, I need to be under 9 inches in diameter, or 8.5, whatever the pressure pot diameter is. So having a more squarish mold that is, say, 3.5 or 4 inches by 5 inches will fit a lot better in the pressure pot rather than a very narrow and long mold. So in my case, I'm making it as square as I can. Now these items are already stuck down. This one I still have to work on, but I want it there as a placeholder so that I can get the other two in. What I've stuck them down with, you could use a drop of crazy glue or cyanoacrylate glue, but I like using two-way tape. The thickness of the tape doesn't really impact any of the silicone getting underneath the edge, and if it does, it's very easy because that's going to be what is going to become your up, to trim that up after the fact. So I find that I get good results using two-way tape. I'm leaving about a 1/2 inch between my items, and when I put the box walls, or build the box, I will leave 1/2 inch between the item and the wall. That is a reference I picked up somewhere that they recommend about a 1/2 inch around, just to ensure that you won't have any drooping in the silicone when you are actually making your molds. It just gives a good enough, a nice thick silicone wall to ensure that you get a good casting coming out the other end. I started with this piece that's going to be cast, this tarp load, and then it had a nice long and a short square side to it that I could put a flat square down and use that as my reference point, just to make sure that it doesn't have to be 100% exactly square. Getting everything to fit well is the ideal. So I like performing it this way, that I can at least ensure that my spacing is going to be adequate, and it will be a nice mold coming out the other end that I won't have any issues with down the line when I do make casts from that mold. Just taking another T-square, using the short side of the previous square to line up on, so that I can get my the other end of the mold in the proper positioning. And while this one is a placeholder at the moment, because I still need to work more on that particular piece, I do want to get everything else ready to go. I can do the boxing in, and then I can apply this piece back in once I've got it ready to go. Now, these two pieces I still have to put down. As I mentioned before, I use two-way tape, and that actually works well in case, as these are, you've got a bit of a depression in them. So I actually needed to use two pieces of tape, one on top of the other, to build up enough that it would adhere down. And the reason why I'm sticking things down, you don't want them moving while you pour. And that actually happened to me in one instance where I thought I was good, but the item, when the silicone was pouring in between the items, actually started pushing the item to be cast off to the side, and I almost had a ruined mold because of that. So this is what I do from learning from that experience. So I will be back in a moment after I get these last two secured, and we'll start in on hot gluing the walls after they've been appropriately cut. So back in a moment. With all but the single one stuck down now, what I've done is used the ruler and marked off a couple points down each side of the mold, half an inch off each of the sides of that relevant piece of item that's going to be casted. Now for my reference, I'll draw the lines on marker on the glass, which is also another handy feature with using glass, that you can use a permanent marker on it to mark out where you want everything to go. So let me do that and we'll be back in a moment. Just to show you what was done, as you can see right in this area here, and on this side, here and here where the gaps were, and there's the two-way tape on the bottom, I actually used silly putty and the X-Acto knife just to kind of pack those gaps closed so that the silicone mold material would not seep into that void and make extracting this item out of the mold itself, in having that become an issue. So I thought that was a very relevant little tip to pass on, of using silly putty, or you could use Mac Tack. Anything that you can shape or force into a void with an X-Acto knife would be relevant in this case. So back in a moment. Here are a few molds that I've previously made. Now, I'd mentioned earlier that using foam was not a great idea, and you can see by this mold that the mold did pick up that texture. And as an example, there's some of the casting plastic that did stick to the end of the mold that is a little difficult to get off. Now, this mold also provides a secondary example of, if you don't secure the material you're casting down to the base, that as you load in the silicone, it can push the mold out of alignment. And in this case, I barely was able to save this casting based on it sliding almost all the way over to the edge. Here's a different casting. As you can see, it's by the glint, it's nice and shiny. I used a plastic container to cast the mold in as its perimeter sides. Now, the ends here are very close, so you do need to be aware of that when you are making the casting and not get them too thin that it could break off. As you can see here, there is a little bit of tear out on this mold that has occurred. Another example is if you look at this mold here, you can see it's more oval than perfectly round. Now that is the mold that was cast in. And what I had to do was to put a clamp lightly around it just to bring it back into round before I actually cast into this mold. So I wanted to provide those examples to you so that you didn't make mistakes that I have made. So back in a moment. While I'm waiting for the glue gun to heat up, I briefly want to talk about finding the volume of your mold so you know how much material you need to prepare of your A and B as a total volume for you to perform your mold casting. What I've done is I've overlapped my panels so that when they're upright, which we'll get to later, it'll be easy to butt one end up against the other panel that's the overlap, and you just do that around. That'll become more clear as we move on. However, finding the volume is your length times width times height. Now, 1 cubic centimeter equals 1 milliliter, and that's the easiest way I've got. I'm not an ounce guy as far as imperial measurements go. It's easy for me in small distances to work in centimeters, and because 1 cubic centimeter equals 1 milliliter, it's a direct relationship. So my length times width times height, and my height I've taken the tallest object and added on ½ an inch to that, which are these markings here that I've made on each of the panels. So that way when I'm actually filling the mold in with the cast, I know that I want to come up to that point to ensure that I've got a good depth from the top of this to the bottom, what will become the bottom of the mold. Now in this case, if I can get the light from shining on the glass, it works out to 435 centimeters cubed, which then is equivalent to 435 milliliters. As it's a part A and a part B mix, then it's approximately 217 mils of part A and 217 mils of part B. Now that is on an empty box. So what I've done is taken, since I've got 4 of these units, that I've taken the length, width, and height of these units. If I can try and get that so it's not shiny, so you can read it, which is approximately 5.85 centimeters cubed. Or taking that value, if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and count those as 6 and 7, counting the little one and that one is 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So 7 times 6 is 42. So I'm accounting approximately 42 mils in volume for the casted parts. So instead of 435 mils, which is the empty box, I'm now looking at 383 mils with the volume of the material I'm going to cast subtracted. So that puts me more at 196 mils of part A and 196 mils of part B that I need to make up. you don't want to make up more than what you have, because that's a waste of material. Going on about waste of material, once you start casting, try and use up in a short time period both your A and B to make your molds. As you can see here, because it's been 4 years since I last made a mold, my part my part A has gone off, as they say. It is already solidified as uncured silicone, because the B, your part B, is the cured silicone. So right there I've probably got a good 2 molds worth, probably a third of each container, that essentially went to waste because I didn't use it in a timely manner and it spoiled due to exposure to air. Now, I have brought in or purchased a new one, and with taxes and delivery that was 50 bucks. So making a mold, 50 Canadian. Making a mold is not cheap. So you want to ensure that you've got enough items that you want to make castings of, so that you utilize all of your part A and your part B, so that you have, one, no wastage when you're creating the molds, and two, that you use all the material up so that you get the most bang for your buck in buying your silicone rubber. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. We'll get more into the casting as we go on, but now we're ready to put the walls together. So let me pause momentarily while I try and get the camera reset up, so that you can hopefully have a good shot of how I go about doing this. So back in a moment. Okay, we'll try this, and hopefully I don't bump the camera and spoil everything. Now, what I've got is some machinist's angle blocks. That's a 3x3x3 square and a 1x2x3 block. Now, I've purchased these so that I can ensure I get a 90-degree angle off of whatever I want to set this on, and set something up against it to get something square as I can. You can use these kind of squares as well. Put that flat and use this surface to get a 90-degree. Though, since I've got the other blocks, I'm going to utilize that. Now, what I want to do is start with one block butting up on the line. So I'm going to roughly get it positioned, and then take the glue gun and put a couple spots of glue on the back end just to hold it in place. And of course, because I'm moving things around, it shifted on me, but at least the glue hadn't completely set up. So that should hold that piece in place for the moment. We'll just continue on. I'm going to use one of these blocks now on this side. And I'm putting the shiny side in and the mark that I want to fill up to on the top end, so I'm trying to keep the orientation the way I want it. Now, having this perfect 90 degrees and dead on the lines isn't a priority. It just makes life easier when you're trying to do things without the third hand that we have not genetically acquired yet, to keep everything in place while you use the hot glue to put a couple holding beads down. And I'm going to do one down the side of the where the two panels meet up to hold that in the corner as well. So hopefully you'll be able to get a better view of this one that I put down. I'm going to use that again. This piece again, as I did on the other side, just so that you can see a little more, hopefully, while I get that lined up. And then I'm just going to put a dab there, come around this side, and put a dab here. And I'm going to have to dig out a stick of glue. I'm empty. But as I'm holding this, I'm ensuring that I've butted up against. If it is off a little bit, it's not a horrendous deal. You can, as long as you run a bead of glue up the edge and seal it, the silicone won't extrude out. What I'm using right now is just the Arrow all-purpose glue sticks. So they're multi-temp, high, dual, and low. But regardless, don't get this melted onto your fingers, because it will burn you and hurt like the dickens for quite a while until everything heals up. Now, if things move on you like they did for me here, because you've only put a couple tabs down, you can easily bend that back and break the glue bond so that you can push it forward again so that it is where you want it to be. So I'm just going to throw another dab of glue down. In both locations, since it did move on me. And then just hold that to let that set up, and run a little bit of glue down that corner joint, just so it's going to cool and hold that in place as well. It is a little bit off, so I'll just hold my finger there a moment so that it can finish setting up. But that's about all that is required. As I said, it doesn't have to be exactly square up and down and, you know, diagonally, and you don't need an exact square box, but you want to have something that will not allow the silicone to seep out after you pour it into the box. And then the last piece we'll put right there. Put a little bit down the corner to hold that. and try and reach around the camera to get some into the other locations. It's got some there. And some there. So I'll just let that set up. Let the glue cool down. I'll remove the blocks once it has, and then I'll seal around all the external edges. So down here fully and up here fully on all four corners, and then the mold box has been completed. And then we'll jump into actually mixing up the silicone and how to determine your volumes and what container you should mix it in and techniques and such and so forth. So back in a moment. So here's a look at the finished glued up box. As you can see, all of the areas where the glue could leak out from have been sealed up, and I've double checked and made sure that there are no little glue filaments that have transferred and fallen into that could ruin the casting. So that's one final check, is to make sure that everything looks good inside. Kind of give your castings a little touch to make sure they're still in place, and then we're ready to make the silicone up, which we'll come back in a moment to do. We know from our calculations that in this would be an underestimated amount, that we need about 196 mils of each part to give us around 393 mils total. Now there will be some loss as we're mixing, and if there is a little bit lower than coming up to the mark that we want, it's not a horrendous occurrence. As long as we've got better than 1/4 inch coverage over our tallest item, we're good. 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, that's really the ideal range. And you don't want to mix your items so that you've got all of them are small and one large. This isn't too bad. This is only about 1/4 inch or 3/8 of an inch larger, so I'm not too concerned about molding this one with the other shorter ones. If I wanted to save on the silicone casting medium, I would not do that with a group of other ones. I would do that by itself. So just a little extra information for you. So as we need roughly 196 mils, so I'm taking a container that I'm fairly confident in as far as volumes go, and I've measured between 190 and 200 mils. Now, as we're not going to use this to mix our A and B, we want separate containers for our A and B to start off with, so that we know we're getting the proper ratios of each one. I usually take a cup and then transfer the liquid, which is water in this case, into the cup, and then mark a line where my target is of part A and part B. Now, since this has water in it, I will take 2 other cups and mark them with a bit of marker, which will then hold my A and B. So that's the next step. So let me pause momentarily while I set that up and get everything ready to go. Back in a moment. In preparation, I've prepared 2 cups marked off of the one that I showed in the previous clip. I've prepared 3 of the jumbo craft sticks. I just used a pair of side cutters to nip the rounded tip off so that I can actually reach the bottom of the cup so I can scrape everything out of the corners. And I have cut down a container that I have poured 2 volumes of from the cup from the previous clip into and mark, so I know that that'll be the total volume once I've mixed part A and part B together. Now this container, I want it large enough that I can have the depth using the stick to get in there, and I can get into the corners with the stick and make sure everything's mixed. If you can always go to Smooth On and check on YouTube and check their videos. They will do it a lot better than I have, a lot more professionally captured. And I welcome you to utilize that resource. So I've got 3 sticks. One stick is to pre-mix the part B. One stick is to pre-mix the part A. Both of the lids say stir well before using, and you want to do your cast around 73 Fahrenheit. Now my Omo 25 has a 15-minute pot life. So that means once I start mixing A and B together, I've only got 15 minutes to pour into the mold. And then it's going to take 75 minutes for the cure to happen. So once I start, I've got to continue. Now, I'm not going to film this next bit, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix each container up. I'm going to pour a volume up into each, and then I'll bring you back when I start pouring them into here and mixing it up, and then we'll switch over to pouring into the mold. So back in a moment. Alright, just in the off chance that my estimates are completely wrong, it's always good to have a small backup mold box ready to go, just in case you've got more left over than you intended. You can may have enough to pour a second mold. So always a good idea. Now I've got my A and B all measured up and ready to go. So let's jump in. Now I'm just going to find a spot for these out of the way where I'm not going to get the A and B that's on them all over everything. So what I normally do is just start pouring A and B in and start mixing them up. Together in the container as I pour them in, and then I'll use the stir sticks to scrape the containers out. And I'm taking a look at the time to make sure that I know when my 15 minutes is up, because I want to make sure come the end of the 15 minutes from now that my pour has been completed. So while that settles out, I'll scrape out to get everything out of the one container. And as clean as I can get them. So I can probably get just a little more out, but I don't want to waste too much time trying to get every drop out and then end up having less time to deal with the A and B curing. Just because I was trying to get every drop out of the containers here. So I'm going to call that good enough. There may be a few mils left in there, but it's not going to make a lot of difference. In the final pour. It's more getting everything out of your cup and keeping it actually in the container you're wanting to transfer it to is more the task than anything, I find. Now, for the most part, that's pretty good. I did have a slight more amount of this part in, but I wasn't going to pull it back out. You have to kind of wait a bit while it settles into the cup because it is so thick. Now, I'm not mixing my stir sticks just in case I've got a bit more left over and I may need to make up just a smidge more if it turns out I need to fill that cup up. Now I'll give you a look at these instructions. You can pause them, but essentially it says before you begin, premix parts A and part B thoroughly. After dispensing equal amounts of part A and B into the mixing container, mix thoroughly for 3 minutes, making sure that you scrape the sides and bottom of the mixing container several times. Mixture should have a uniform color and no color streaks. If you observe color streaks, continue mixing until they are eliminated. Pouring. For best results, pour your mixture in a single pot at the lowest point of the containment field. Let the rubber seek its level up and over the model. A uniform flow will help minimize entrapped air. The liquid rubber should level off at least ½ inch over the highest point of the model surface. So there's the quick instructions. So now we'll get mixing here. Now when it comes to pouring, I'm going to be holding this container probably about a foot above the bottom of the mold box so that I get and control it so that I get a very thin stream coming that's pouring out from this container, and that will allow any air bubbles present to break to the surface. So right now I'm not very concerned about any air bubbles I may mix into the rubber as I'm mixing the part A and part B together. But I do want to make sure that I drag the mixing stick over the bottom, and as you can see there's a little bit of green there, so I'm not completely mixed. Now I'm going to move this out of the camera field for a moment so that I can mix it thoroughly, so I'll be back in a moment. Mixing is complete, and here's what it looks like. There's you can see lots of air bubbles on the surface, but it's a nice uniform color, and I've mixed it for a minimum of 3 minutes. So now I'm going to make a little pour spout, and then I'm going to start pouring it, and I'm going to target right here in the mold. And if I have to, I can use the stir stick against the edge like this to ensure that it's going to fall where I want it to. So we'll start the pour. And then it's just a very slow pour. As the rubber finds its way between the items being molded, and going as thin a stream as possible will eliminate as much, though it's hard to do, especially with it working around a camera. But just trying to let it ooze between the mold items and being as stringy as possible to eliminate as much air bubbles present as possible. Now, if I had done this on a base that I could fit in the pressure pot, after I've got it poured, I could stick it in the pressure pot and pressurize it, and that would decrease any air bubbles that were present. And shrink them so that they would not have any impact. So now I've pulled the stir stick away, and I'm just pouring it directly from the container and slowly moving the stream so that it can encompass around the items. But I don't want to go so slow that I run short of time on the material. So you have to have that time balance. As more of the mold gets covered, you can pour a little faster because it's encompassing the items with minimal air bubbles, that's the critical step. And once they're covered, then you can go a little faster, because any air bubbles that could be present won't be part of the mold that will come in contact with your liquid plastic. So I'm going to speed up my pour and raise it up a little higher. And the risk that you take in doing a mold of multiple items is the volume of material that you are utilizing, that to meet the deadline of the setup time, that you may actually introduce air bubbles around the items as you're pouring it in, or entrap air around the items as you're trying to beat the setup time. So I'm going to finish scraping this out. It looks like I do not need the second mold, that my estimate was fairly close. There's not a lot left in the container. As you can see, there's just a skim on the surface, and if I move it around, that I'm under my target point, but I'm hitting the point where the mold is starting to get thicker as it cures. So I'll just scrape the remainder of this in, and then I'll bring you back. Okay, so I've poured everything into the mold, and what I'm doing now is just jiggling the top surface just to smooth out the mold surface across, so that the pour actually stays level, and also to help any of the bubbles that are entrapped come to the surface. Now, I'm kind of paying attention as to the consistency of the mold, and as soon as I see that it is not settling easily, I'm going to stop what I'm doing so I don't mess up the bottom of the mold. But I do want to try and wiggle out as much of the air bubbles as I can. So what I'm doing is actually working the stick along the molds in the bottom, just to make sure that there is no air. It's still settling, so I believe I've got a little bit of time still that any of the waves that I'm making, or any of the creases, are actually settling back down into the surface of the cast, like as if you watch that glob that I just scraped in, it should still settle down. I'll just kind of work these few air bubbles that I can see. But we're hitting the point where I probably need to leave it alone and just let it sit. So let me disconnect the camera from the tripod and I'll give you a good look at the surface. So here's a close look up at the surface. The volume calculation was pretty much right on. I don't really want to mess around with it anymore. As you can see, that big glob hasn't quite settled back down in, so that is telling me not to mess with the surface anymore, that the curing is starting to happen, and just let it be at this point and it'll be what it will be. But that took about half of the container to make this one mold of the 8 items. So this is a $25 cast, is what it really breaks down to. So you have to be prepared to spend the money and take the risk of it not turning out, just like anything we do in the hobby. So we'll let that sit and cure, and then we'll come back after it's had its minimum of sit on the Instructions, I believe it said 75-minute cure time. So I'll come back. I'm going to give it a good 2 hours just because of the volume of the mold. We'll let it be for a couple hours, and then I'll bring you back and show you how it's set up. So back in a moment. Just an aside about cleanup, as I want to reuse this container to continue mixing the Omo 25 in, I wiped it out with a paper towel. And as for the Part A and Part B cups and sticks, those will not be reused. They'll just go right into the garbage. And anything that I laid them on, the sticks on, will go in a garbage, so that there's no Part A and Part B, because they will not cure unless they're mixed together. So these aren't good to keep past the initial mixing. I would be very hesitant in using them, so right into the garbage they go. And just another look at the mold. As you can see, that spot in the center hasn't completely flattened out, and you can see the couple of the air bubbles that I popped. You can see the little pock marks that they've left behind as it starts curing and creating a skin on the surface of the mold. So we'll be back in a couple hours to take another look. So till then, back in a moment. No, it hasn't been quite 2 hours yet, but I wanted to talk about something before coming back to the mold. Is in the instructions they recommend using a mold release, such as this product that Micromark sells, and Smooth On, of course, sells their own, as per it states in the instructions. As I've got some experience in dealing with making the molds already, because I'm using very smooth items that are being casted, as far as smooth plastic items, I'm not too concerned about the release, and I didn't feel I needed to do it on this particular mold. When I do cast any plastic in this newly created mold, I will spray the mold down first prior to adding in the plastic resin. And as a reminder, always wash your hands after working with chemicals. In this case, I didn't wear gloves, and I was very careful not to get any on my hands. However, I'm going to wash my hands right now, and then we'll wait the 2 hours until the mold is cured, and then we'll open it up and see what we got. So back in a moment. And we're back, and it's been probably about 3.5 hours later. So a little more than the recommended 75 minutes, but I want to make sure that everything's good to go. So taking a look at the surface again, you can see how that one little blob there has settled, but didn't merge directly back into everything else, and how it's very firm now. Pushing down on it, it's very solid, so I'm very sure everything is good there. Let's try the corner. Am I going to separate from the... Oh, there, I got to break the edge. There it is. It's peeling back off the... There we go. So it's going to release. Let me get a blade or an X-Acto knife and break this glue joint, and then I'll bring you back and we'll peel the sides off and take a look at the mold. Back in a moment. Okay, I've got most of the hot glue off the bottom, so let's see if we can get the sides off with a little bit of wiggling and see if I can actually salvage the sides for later without, oh, looks like I'm delaminating it, but okay, there, I got that off. Oh, not too much spillage into the cracks where the sides were meeting the glass, so that's good. Now, getting the block itself to release, because all of the mold, or the items to be molded, are two-way taped down, so let's get the wiggle the mold here, just pull the corners up to get it to lift off the glass. Start releasing. I may end up leaving the items to be molded stuck to the glass. Let's see if I can twist it a bit to break them loose without breaking the... Okay, we got everything there. Alright, so not too bad. Is that caused by me or just a little bit of air bubble? Let's get the tape off. Okay, so not a whole lot left on the glass, so I'm not seeing any bits of mold material. So I'm guessing that these little bits right here were a couple of air bubbles, but that's pretty good. That creeped in a little bit. That's not too bad. Now these little bits, you don't want to tear them off with your fingers. You want to use a brand new X-Acto blade to trim them, or a pair of scissors or something along that line. Otherwise you'll rip the mold and it won't be a good a cast as you could get. So let's just stretch the mold around the items a little bit to get it to release off the edges. Okay, that's looking good. Everything seems to be releasing off. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to try and get remove these by hand rather than just peeling the mold off, is because I didn't want to rip the mold at the base by having these cast pieces remain on the table. Alright, let me set you up on the tripod so I can have both hands, and then we'll give this a go and pop everything out. So back in a moment. Okay, so we're back, and I'll try and do this in focus and without banging the tripod of the camera. So all I'm doing is I'm just pushing on the center while peeling back the casting and then just popping it out. So that's one wood pallet stack. There's the second. They're coming out nice and easy, and oh, we got a fail. We got a void right there. I don't know if you can, yeah, you can make it out. Oh well. That one's not too bad. Maybe a little bit of a bubble there. But okay, so one possible issue, but that's only on one side, so that can be worked on. It'll just be a bit of extra that'll have to be pulled away. Now for the crate. Crate's got some air bubbles, and there's another major air bubble there, so that'll have to have some work done on it. It's not very often that I make a casting of so many at one time. All my other castings I usually do 2 pieces unless they're really, really small, so this was kind of a go to town to see if it would work casting. And the air bubbles, yeah, there's another big air bubble there. So I think the volume that I had to dispense was so much that in my hurry, because I was hitting my end time on the silicone, that it didn't have enough. It took too long to mix, I guess is what I'm trying to say, and that it was approaching its cure time, and then getting it in around these items, I was hurrying more than I should have. And yeah, there's a little air bubble in there. It didn't allow the resin to creep around the items as one would like, and it entrapped the air bubbles. So okay, so those little dots there actually are part of the casting, so that's good. The detail did get picked up, and there doesn't seem to be any major air bubbles in there, and if there are minor air bubbles, then we'll just have to deal with that. Now, how did this tarp load work out? See that without having to use the spray release on them, they're all coming out fairly easily because they're a smooth plastic, and it didn't give the silicone wasn't getting into little pits in the surface. That's when you need your mold release. So that turned out quite nice. I'm quite happy with that detail. So just a few that had air bubbles. Now let's see this piece. Now this is going to come off because the bottom was done that way, and I had silly puttied the voids closed, and that's what's peeling off now is the silly putty. But let's try and pop this out. Now, because it is round, it does need a little bit more to get it extracted from the mold. But it looks fairly good. Just a little bit of trimming on that edge, as I mentioned before. A little bit of silly putty that's stuck there. Okay, and that one came out with no major air bubbles, so only a few. So one couple air bubbles there, two. So 2 major log loads that had air bubbles, and the one crate that has a couple. But otherwise, a fairly good mold that should last me the number of casts that I want to do, I'll take scissors or put it down and run a brand new X-Acto blade to trim these little flaps off the mold. And as I said before, an X-Acto knife or scissors to get rid of these flaps here. And we've got a nice smooth surface that none of the plastic resin will get trapped in, so that looks good. And I do want to mention that anything that I'm making a mold of, it has come as loads on cars. I've not made these myself, and I'm not selling these. So it's kind of the ethical aspect to making molds of something as well, is I'm just doing this to generate more items for my layout. I'm not going to make castings of any of this to sell and compete against the original manufacturer. So be aware and conscious of that ethical aspect of making molds for yourself. So at this point, I'm going to sign off and end this video. I hope you were able to gain some knowledge. And the next video coming up, once I've got all this trimmed down, we'll break out the Smoothcast 310 and we'll make some castings using this mold that was just made. And I'll go over how to figure out how much volume you need. The easiest way that I've found to do that, because you need to know how much part A and part B of the liquid plastic resin that you need to mix together in generating a mold. And it's always good to have more than one mold ready to go. Again, that all the figuring worked out. This turned out exactly as anticipated. And at this point, we'll see you on the next video. So, bye for now.